Hi, everyone. This is Jason Bierek of Wall Street from Main Street. Welcome back to another Wall Street from Main Street podcast interview. Today's special guest is a returning guest. He's editor of the Hat Trick Letter at goldenjackass.com. Jim Willie, thank you for joining me again.
Oh, good to be on, Jason.
Now, Jim, I don't know if you caught this, but the former Goldman Sachs alumni and current Minneapolis Federal Reserve Bank president recently said in a public speech that the Federal Reserve serves Main Street. Do you agree with him on that?
Serves Main Street?
Yeah.
Not even 5% of their devoted vested interest is Main Street. Pardon me. The member banks of the Federal Reserve, the regional bank, they all report to the main headquarters, and they serve the Wall Street banks and the big banks of the United States. I would put their loyalty and devotion at over 95%. Look what they've done in the last 5 years since 0% and QE has been put on. I think QE began in 2012. The big objective, openly stated by the Fed and many of its governors out in the field, was we need to prevent price inflation from hitting the main economy, Main Street, and to do that, we have to wall off all the QE bond bailouts and prevent it from leaking into the economy. The word leaking, to me, connotes an intention to prevent capital formation, business expansion, job hiring, plant and equipment, and all that. Now, we have a few mavericks among the Fed governors. I like Richard Fisher of Dallas. I don't think he's in his post anymore, but he sure is quoted a lot. He's been saying for the longest time that QE is insane and that we're on the wrong path, that we have no exit strategy. I follow the Mavericks because the Mavericks prove to me that the Fed and all its regional governors have no concern whatsoever for the tangible economy in Main Street. Zero.
Yeah, I think what the Federal Reserve, what they would try to say, and this would be a lie in my opinion, they would try to say, oh, look, your 401k is up, your housing and real estate prices are up, and that's how we helped Main Street. But, you know, most people on Main Street, Jim, right now, they don't have a lot of savings and they don't own a lot of assets. So most of this asset price inflation that the Federal Reserve has been creating for decades, I think it mostly benefits, hedge fund managers, investment banks, Wall Street, and then also this manipulation of the interest rates. That benefits governments that are able to, borrow even more money at a lower and lower interest rate. So I don't see how that really helps Main Street. I see, Main Street, the people I talk to on Main Street, their lives are getting worse all the time.
I think the other argument that the central bankers would make is if the health and viability and capital structure that underpin the big Wall Street banks, if that all is made healthy and firm, there's an immediate, general, positive effect throughout the whole economy in Main Street. The trouble is, it's a bunch of bullshit. The trouble is that the main businesses of Wall Street are their derivatives and their bond carry trades. They borrow at the zero and invest in the treasury bonds, earn that 2% VIG, put on leverage, and suddenly they have a better capital structure. It's not from lending. It's not from the credit portfolios. The big banks are scared to death of their credit portfolios because the energy sector is going to hell in a handbasket right now. Now, the big banks don't have any devotion to the main economy. They have contempt. How many times have you read a story in the last 3 or 4 years that the big banks don't find many credit-worthy clients to lend money to? We hear it all the time. So what they do is they do the bond carry trade. They borrow at zero and invest on the 2% and put on futures leverage to multiply it by 20 to 30. That's, if they get 20-fold leverage on a 2% arbitrage, they're making 40%. And that's why you're not seeing the interest rate rise, because the Wall Street banks are borrowing at 0%. If you want to wreck their carry trade for bonds, then raise interest rates. They're not going to do that. And I don't really believe the December action was an interest rate hike. I think it was a little fiddling with the switchgear to make the reverse repos work properly.
Yeah, I also saw an interesting video from my friend Lewis over at Small Gold. He thinks that the Federal Reserve is threatening to still raise interest rates to protect the dollar index, that they can't really raise interest rates anymore, that they've been just trying to meddle with the dollar's exchange rate now instead of an interest rate increase going forward.
Well, absolutely, and they're losing their credibility by doing it, I think, about 30 consecutive times without raising the rates. And you really take a close look at what happened in December, and it's not really a rate hike. So they're not going to do a real rate hike after a fake rate hike. It's getting very interesting and very dicey. They cannot defend the dollar anymore except with jet aircraft, howitzers, and naval destroyer vessels. That's how we're defending the dollar.
Yeah, and last year we did an interview, Jim, you and me, and you talked about how interest rates will never rise, and a lot of the regular Wall Street people that listened to the interview said you were wrong, and over a year later, you've been proven right. All these central bankers that were saying that they were going to raise rates, they haven't really done anything yet.
Well, those same people would not give us credit, Jason. They would say, yeah, but the interest rate hike is right around the corner. No,
yeah,
idiots like that are wedded to their notions, and they never admit they're wrong. I have lost 2 friends in the last few years over my position that we will never have a war with Iran. I called it stupid talk, and a friend of mine in Ohio said he differed in his opinion, and a day later we said, how about it if we never talk to each other, after about 30 different volleys back and forth. Okay? Now, when I contact that same person once in a long while, he said, yeah, but the Iran war, it's going to be this year. They never admit they're wrong. It's always going to happen next year. It's kind of like the second half recovery for the economy.
Yeah, and I think those people will still be saying, even when the Federal Reserve doesn't raise interest rates, oh, it's coming. It'll come in the next couple months. And, they just don't want to admit they're wrong. And they don't want to admit also that the Federal Reserve should have zero credibility. They still want to believe in the Fed because a lot of them make a lot of money off owning general stocks.
Well, they make money on following the Fed trend. And they say the trend is your friend, and never buck the Fed, never go against the Fed. And I think the Fed is in a corner where they're going to be liquidated and seen in history as a gigantic failure. I mean, they have 4.2 or 4.3 trillion in their balance sheet. Is anything on their balance sheet worth more than 10 cents on the dollar? I don't think so.
Yeah, I think all these central bankers are all failures, but they'll never admit that. They'll blame someone else for their problems. The U.S. has been blaming, I think, China, the China economy, for the reasons why they won't increase interest rates, and now it's Europe and Brexit. I want to transition now to the next topic, and that is the ECB, the EU, and Brexit. Do you think the powerful politicians and bureaucrats running the EU will actually allow Brexit to occur?
I don't know, Jason. I'm going to be honest here. I think the polls are working now at about 15 to 20% in favor of exit. I think the elites there are scared pissing in their pants because if they rig the election, there might be some kind of an open revolt because it's so clear to so many that it's a 15 to 20% differential. And what I'm hearing, though, is I've been calling for vote rigging. Remember, what was it, 2 years ago or a year and a half ago, the Scottish independence? Okay, they rigged the vote. Okay, I'm not going to get into all the details about how they rigged the vote, and I'm expecting they're going to try to rig the vote here, but rigging the vote might not mean more than cheating by 5 or 6%, and it might still fail on the rig. What they're doing now is they're making eligible, all immigrants who can get some sort of an insurance card, not a citizenship card. Okay, so they're going to ship in all kinds of Arabs to vote for staying in the EU. I mean, this is sickening stuff, undermining democracy that's been undermined now for the last 30 years. It's not a new trend. But I think they're going to try to rig the election using immigrants as one tool, using machines that just record the wrong number, using software that changes the votes. I mean, I have a friend, I love telling this very brief story. I've got a friend in Philadelphia, and for the Bush 2 versus Kerry vote in 2004, he volunteered in Philadelphia to be a vote monitor in the Germantown precinct of Philadelphia. And he and 5 others got there at a half hour early, about 7 in the morning. They inspected all the machines, and every single machine had an initial value of 500 for Bush. Rigging elections is not difficult. They make it illegal to challenge the vote, illegal to challenge the software for Diebold. The United States is exporting their vote rigging technology. I expect that they're going to try to rig it in Britain, and at the very worst, they're going to declare the vote null from all the problems as they discover the rig attempts. I don't know, but the consequences are pretty stark. I was talking with a very smart guy yesterday connected with the U.S. government, and he said, Britain would do well to negotiate all its trade contracts one-on-one and not through the EU. The advantages are huge, but the disadvantages are significant too. The capital flight and a lot of other things. I'm actually in a position where I must study this in the next 2 or 3 days because I'm coming up with my final report for June that will cover the Brexit. And I don't say anything ever like, oh, well, I know what that is, but I can't say now. No, I don't know what it all is about. I'm reading about it, and there was just an article that caught my attention about how the Swedish, president, I think it's a president, a woman, is warning Cameron and criticizing Cameron for entertaining even the notion of an exit. So there's a lot of pressure from member states in the European Union, and there's a lot of aspects that I'm not quite clear on. I'm going to try to read up in the next couple of days, but my answer and my position is so clear, so firm. They're going to rig it because it's easier than doing a campaign, which they've done with a lot of propaganda, lies, and deceit, and all kinds of craziness on the airwaves. That costs money. Rigging does not cost much of anything. You just block out an entire district. Gosh, in the Obama re-election, there were entire districts in Philadelphia that had 0 votes for Mitt Romney. Probability dictates that that's almost impossible. So I expect vote rigging, and I don't have a really deep response to this, but I believe that exiting the European Union would be good for Britain, and it would be good in another very large picture sense. It would work to break up the European Union itself. And I think that's what the Dutch have already voted for. The union's not working. It's proving to be a fascist dictatorship. It's proving to be a warmongering platform. It's proving to be very unpopular in a sense that doesn't give a shit about people's opinions. That's anti-popular, I think.
Yeah, and there's a great documentary about the Brexit, and it talks about all these politicians and bureaucrats at the European Union in Brussels. There's tens of thousands of them making 6-figure salaries, which is more than the UK Prime Minister Cameron is making. And, here these guys, they can't be fired, and they make all these extra money. And then there's this great story. I don't know if you saw it on Zero Hedge. It's basically they're reporting a propaganda video that the ECB made inside their trading floor showing how good their asset purchase is going of buying up, bank bonds and government bonds and things like that, and how they're manipulating markets. Did you see that piece?
No, I didn't, but it's not surprising because all markets are rigged by the Anglo-Americans. There are no fair financial markets. All their leaders are not beholden in any way at all to the people. They're beholden to the elites. So it's a big club, and there are advantages for being in the club for taking advantage of rigged markets. So not surprising at all. It's just one more log on the same fire. This is disgusting what's happening in the progression toward the fascist dictatorship, which I steadfastly oppose.
Yeah, I completely agree. There's just so much of that in the US and Europe right now. And there's, the status quo makes so much money off manipulating asset prices up and down, whichever way they choose. My next question is about Bilderberg. Since we had the meeting in Dresden, Germany recently, do you think the economic and political elites there were meeting at the recent Bilderberg meeting to discuss how to implement fully digital currencies and a cashless society on a global scale?
Well, maybe. I think their other issues would be continuing Agenda 21 and the extermination of planet Earth. I think that's a high-level project of theirs. I read, and I've only read it in one account, that a Rothschild was presiding over the Bilderberger meeting. I've got an opinion that I'm going to share about the Bilderbergers before I get more in depth on their agenda. I have a rule of thumb, a rule to operate by that The Voice taught me. And this was way back in 2009 when we had very frequent conversations getting to know each other. We were talking in general about how powerful are the narco barons? Have they worked their way into the elite banker crew? How does that work on the politics of joining a banker syndicate? If you own a lot of money and have a huge income from narco sources, does that give you a seat at the table? Where do the Bilderbergers fit in? Where does the Z group? I vowed long ago never to mention the four-letter Z word, their syndicate. It's the Khazars, essentially. And here's what The Voice taught me. He said, if you ever hear about a group, read anything about that group, learn anything about that group's agenda, then they're not important. For the simple reason that they're not in the secrecy, in the shadows. The fact that you heard anything means that they're not protected, they're not high level, and they're not secure in what they're doing in their activities. And it was quite interesting because right about that time there was an event at the Vancouver airport. I went to speak at, I think that particular one was June in 2007 in Vancouver. It was at the Cambridge House Conference and their circuit. They had 2 per year in Vancouver, and it's a wonderful place to go. I met a lot of great people, and I really liked Vancouver. It was a lot of fun, things to do, great places to walk, but mainly to meet people. And something happened, Jason, at that, I believe it was June 2007 meeting. There was a big hubbub in the press because the Vancouver Customs at the airport blocked all the Bilderbergers from coming in to have one of their supposedly secret meetings. Must not have been secret. Why didn't they just fly into private airport and tell the customs officials to go F you? Because they don't have power. And they were embarrassed. If you have great power, you're never embarrassed. You have all these things prearranged. And if anyone gets in the way, you have them shot. Or you have them demoted and kicked off the force. So why were the Bilderbergers embarrassed in June of 2007? Because they don't have power. So back to the agenda. I don't think the Bilderbergers with Schmidt of Google and other corporate representatives, I don't think they have the power to install cashless society, digital currency. No, that's a central bank function. So I don't know what their agenda was, except for the same old, laced viruses to kill people, chemtrails to kill people, GMO foods to force people into sterility, contaminating water systems through fracking, and other Agenda 21 items. So that's what I think the Bilderbergers' agenda is. All the implementation, execution of Agenda 21 and the global extermination project. If you think chemtrails are exhaust at 30,000 feet from commercial airplanes, I got some news for you. You're a moron. I have talked to many morons, including my own father. And I said, Dad, when you look up there and you see the chemtrails, do you notice that they stay in place for half an hour or an hour? Yeah. And I said, are you aware that if they're water crystals, they'd last less than 5 minutes, maybe 3? No. Are you aware that if they're water crystals, when there's such low pressure up there and exposure to sunlight, that the pressure will vaporize it almost as fast as the sunlight? No. Okay, Dad, you're a moron, okay? I hope you don't have a big problem with that, but you're a moron, okay? Okay, the moron level in the U.S. society is running, in my opinion, at 80 to 90%.
Yeah, I would agree with that. Have you seen the Mark Dice videos where he asks people if they want to either have a bar of chocolate or a 100-ounce bar of silver, or he's asking people on the beach if they know what the capital of the United States is, and people can't even name it's Washington, D.C.?
I saw the first one, and I remember some of the responses in detail from the people who did not want the bar of silver. One said, no, I wouldn't. It wouldn't have any value. I wouldn't know what to do with it. It's not worth anything. They're not even clear on what it's worth. This is the moron society that we're dealing with. And you know, when you talk to people who had a real good service record for, say, World War II in a noble war, of course you could argue against that if you wanted to get into the raw details. But is this the country, and are these the morons that soldiers died to protect our freedom for? No, not at all. I would not lift a rifle and join the military in order to protect people who didn't know what capital was, didn't know what inflation was, didn't know what fascism was, and certainly don't know what money and freedom are.
Yeah, and these same people, Jim, they want Bernie Madoff nominated as the vice president for Bernie Sanders. But if you do ask them what the sports, but if you do ask them what the sports scores are, or who Khloe Kardashian is dating now, I bet you they would know every single detail.
Well, they'd know a lot of details. I remember there was a different video to expose the moron level of our society. And what they did was they asked some finance questions like, who were the two opponents during the U.S. Civil War? Oh, that's a beautiful question. And most people did not know what it was. But then they went straight to other questions like, who's Snoop Doggy Dogg, or Khloe Kardashian, and questions like that about the pop culture. And it was amazing. They had like over a 90% correct record for the pop culture, and they had under a 10% correct record for the important questions of U.S. history. Oh, it's shameful. I mean, I'm embarrassed sometimes. I got into a big hubbub in I remember it was like yesterday. I think it was October of 2007 in Toronto, where I closed off a speech by saying, it's so embarrassing nowadays. It's embarrassing to be an American. It's embarrassing to try to defend the stupidity that's out there, the ignorance that's out there. They don't know what money is. They don't know anything about what's going on in economics. They couldn't even refute the price inflation statistics. They march off to war. There's no war that they find distasteful anymore. And oh gosh, I can't think of his name, but some idiot was following up with me, and he misquoted me, and we got into a real big tiff where I was so angry that I brought in the manager to the Cambridge House entire conference, and I said, would you put a leash on this idiot? And they did, because he misquoted me in front of a crowd. So
Now, Jim, I want to transition now and ask you about Brazil. We have the Olympics coming up, the Summer Olympics in Brazil, which is, I think Brazil is shaping up to be a giant disaster, and it's going to be on public TV, public display with the protests and things like that. Why do you think all these things are happening at once to Brazil, where, the president is undergoing impeachment, PetroBras is in problems, we have the Zika virus, and now the Olympics is going on? Do you think then that there's maybe an agenda behind this with the U.S. government or the Chinese looking to go in there and buy up the mining assets, so the oil assets of Petrobras pretty cheap?
I think it's mostly about the oil assets, but it's more than just that. I got to be careful what I say. It happens to be, unfortunately, coincidental with the Olympics. But 2 years ago, there was a very strong opposition candidate that the Americans did not like. His name was Eduardo Campo, and he unfortunately died in a small plane crash that a lot of people believe was a Langley project. And one of the confirming items of evidence was that one of the people who is running around now with increased power is a person who was scheduled to be on the same plane with Campo, and in the last 5 minutes was pulled off. This is a telltale signal of murder at high level. So the PetroBras contracts are on the table. Until a month ago, I was of the opinion that they were going to go almost exclusively to China and Russia for development. Now I think it's much more likely that the Western Seven Sisters will take control, and China and Russia will get maybe nothing. They might get one item in order for the West to claim that China and Russia were not shut out completely. In other words, throw them a scrap and let them pick it up off the floor. Okay, there's a whole lot more going on than just PetroBras, although that is very big. The corruption in Brazil is so complete, widespread, deep, broad, pervasive. It's all through their police forces. It's through most of their companies. We get a lot of attention given to Chavez and the National Oil Company of Venezuela. But the same sorts of things were going on with PetroBras, with sweetheart deals, with people without any engineering background in high positions, without much of any plowback into capital investment, maintenance, etc. And what they did was they gutted the pig. And now the pig is for sale. And what the foreigners are doing is saying, get the pig off the table. We don't want all that mess in the way. We just want these undeveloped projects in what they call the deep salts, under huge layers of salty structures in the ocean, and not at great depths. I'm hearing like 200 meters. We're not talking about 1.5 miles deep. So when it's not real deep, it's not real expensive. But when you got to penetrate the salts, it adds to some of the costs. It's not as bad as going through rock. Okay, there's a lot more going on there. There's some conflicts over bonds, and I don't want to discuss more because I'm still trying to gather some information, and I'm wondering how much of it is confidential that cannot be mentioned. But just take a look at the central banker there, and you find an Israeli-born guy. Take a look at Kiev in Ukraine, and you see a lot of Israelis in certain posts. And then ask yourself the question, who did it?
Yeah, Jim, I think the Western investment banks, either in Europe or the U.S., they loaded the Petrobras balance sheet with lots of debt when the oil price was high. I think they took on over $100 billion worth of debt, and they didn't even have that much oil production. So this was all, drilling on debt for future oil supply that, the oil production had to come online at a certain price just to pay the debt back. Things got so crazy at one point at the end of 2014 when the oil price had just started to drop that their debt to equity ratio for Petrobras was 7-1. So a 14% drop in their equity, and they were totally insolvent then. Things were that crazy at one point. And I've also heard, from there's videos out there of Brazilians who are being interviewed who are libertarians. By the way, Brazil has a rapidly growing libertarian population. I think that's great that people on the streets in Brazil are starting to wake up to what's really going on. But it's really interesting. One of the persons who was interviewed in Rio in front of the PetroBras building by Luke Radomski, he actually said that PetroBras is insolvent. Everyone in Brazil knows it, and Wall Street's just trying to keep them alive to figure out how to chop up the pieces.
Well, that's clearly true. There's an overarching issue here. I like to start at the top and work down when it comes to the power structure. Brazil is in the American hemisphere. So Washington and Langley have a very strong vested interest not to allow Russia and China to gain a tremendous foothold. The fact that the BRICS had Brazil as a key element was a grand insult to the once powerful Washington crew. So they killed Campo. They funded the anti-corruption campaign. Langley has spent quite a bit of money and placed quite a few assets, namely people, in the picture in Brazil in order to bring this about. And they've got a success, but it's not over, because what remains is an impeachment process. Dilma is not dead, and she's not even dead politically. She's challenged. Remember back in the Watergate days, people used to think, again, out of deep ignorance, that if Nixon were impeached, he's gone. No, he's challenged. It's like indicted. Impeach means indictment, people. Dilma is not dead. She's being challenged through indictments on the car wash controversy, which is turning out to be a lot bigger than many people expected. It's possible that Dilma will have a countermeasure soon, that maybe some kind of nationalist group will come up and push out foreign elements. There are European, British, and American elements in there running the anti-corruption campaign. If they can be isolated and identified, the nationalists in Brazil might have a counter push. I don't know. But, just keep in mind, like Ecuador and Panama, this is U.S. backyard. They're not going to let it go easily. They're not going to let the Panamanians create a gold currency unless the Americans run it.
Yeah, I think it's a fustercluck, Jim, in Brazil right now, and there's going to be a lot of protests and riots. I don't know if the TV cameras are going to show them during the Olympics, but we're going to hear like secondhand accounts or Twitter videos. We're going to see on social media that there's going to be a lot of people marching in the streets, demanding anti-corruption thing. I feel bad for the Brazilians, who didn't want any of this stuff to happen, and misallocation of capital with the Olympics, with so much corruption and government unbidded contracts and stuff that went to the corrupt construction companies there.
Yeah. Well, there's another angle to this. If you're going to mention the fusterclucks, then I'm going to mention the cunning linguists. Okay, I've got some sick friends who go to Medellin, Colombia, and who go to Rio de Janeiro, and they're, to be sure, rather sick people with really only one or two dimensions operating in their lives. They told me that a year ago, all the brothels in Rio de Janeiro were kicked out and shut down. They were all told you must go 20 miles out into the suburbs. And the reason given to them was, we're going to start this process early, a year and a half, in order to clean up the atmosphere for the showcase globally of the Summer Olympics. Okay, now, do you really think there are going to be demonstrations close to the Olympic activities and competition? No, I don't. You think we're going to have a televised event where, like, say, a marathon is going through the streets and we're going to see a bunch of people with banners and throwing rocks and maybe even a Molotov cocktail? No. They're going to have their heads beaten in, and thrown out 20 miles into the suburbs. Okay. That's my opinion. The Olympics will go on, and almost without a hitch, if there's a hitch in the Olympics, it's going to be from a screw up from construction where a venue is not quite ready.
Now, Jim, I want to stay in the BRICS, but I want to ask you about China. China is now issuing RMB bonds from either the BRICS Bank or the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank. In your opinion, what does this mean for the global financial system and the petrodollar?
Oh, golly. It means a lot. First of all, let's define the IMF special drawing rights. It's a basket of currencies. It's dominated by the dollar. And in second place is the euro. And then you have the British pound and the Japanese yen. So the issuance of Chinese RMB bonds is going to use, after issuance, they're going to use the fact that the IMF has included with an agreement, and there was a battle for this. Oh, it was really quite entertaining. I think it was May of 2015. The IMF said, no, you guys in China are not ready yet. So China went out and sold $250 billion of treasury bonds, forced the Fed to soak it all up. No effect on the bond yield. Isn't that a miracle? But the Americans heard the message. So right away, I think it was last October or so, the Chinese RMB was gained admittance into the IMF currency basket called the SDR. Okay, that I think is the big event. That is the main event on the global financial stage as it relates to the RMB, because grants are given from IMF funds according to the weights and percentages of the IMF SDR basket. So the banks, the major banks of the world that do business and carry out the executed plans for the IMF, they're going to have to hold some Chinese RMB bonds. And what are they going to get rid of in order to make room for the RMB bond? They're going to get rid of dollars. I did see the actual percentages, and I noticed that the biggest decline, the biggest drop from before and after was with the dollar. Others had a drop. The yen change was the smallest, so don't expect them to drop Japanese government bonds in favor of Chinese RMB bonds. Expect them to drop treasuries and euro bonds, mostly treasuries. So that's a ticket in the door for China. Now add to that the other very significant development for China and its RMB internationalization project, and that's the RMB centers, the RMB hubs as they're called. And right now there are a number of different hub trading centers, but there are really only two giant RMB hubs, and that's Frankfurt, Germany, and London, England. And a hub is defined as a center where there's extensive currency trading in RMB and extensive RMB-based bond trading. In other words, take for instance Italy. They haven't done this yet, but I think they're going to do it, and it's going to be a decent splash. I think Spain already has some RMB-denominated debt for the Spanish government debt. That's quite unique. Italy is going soon to, say, in London, issue a big swath of, say, $10 billion worth of euro bonds, except they're going to be denominated in Chinese RMB. Now, what's so special about that? Well, Italian and European investors could buy into and invest in these Italian government debt bonds and not have any currency risk except to the Chinese RMB. And if the Chinese RMB goes up, their investment goes up. So for two sides, European investors will like the Italian RMB bonds. They will like the fact that if the euro goes down, which I expect that it will, they're not going to be at risk. They also like the fact that if China makes some positive gestures toward a gold currency, or even just has a rebound from some of the recent problems, and the RMB goes up, they're going to be benefiting on their bond purchase investments. So I think we're seeing a lot of other things, Jason, that are opening the doors for the RMB. One is accounting standards that were made more firm, and the Chinese conformed with some international standards, because after the May 2015 rejection of the RMB with the IMF basket, China said, what do you need? What do you require? And they were told, well, you need the standards conformity, and you also need more capital accounts, just for instance, so the Colombian peso can be converted directly to the Chinese RMB without an intermediate step like the dollar. Okay, so China, in those 4 months from May to September, they fulfilled the obligations and forced the issue by the $250 billion worth of treasury bonds that they dumped. So we're seeing a lot of steps by China, and now the most recent steps have been the Shanghai gold steps for the gold futures contract and the gold price fix. So I think we're going to see a lot of movement. And the main disappointment that I've had with the RMB in the last year or so is that it's not really making very big increased strides in two areas. It's not making big strides upward in the percentage of trade payments being settled in RMB, and it's not making big strides in the increase of global banking reserves that are RMB based. And one reason for the latter is that the Chinese don't have a lot of international debt floating around. The United States has a huge advantage by being $18 trillion bankrupt. It's so paradoxical, Jason. One of the big problems for Germany right now is they just don't have enough debt. So their interest rates are falling. They don't have adequate supply of toilet paper debt. So their bond yields are going down. Wow. It's upside down. Everything is upside down in the global financial structure. The weakest nations are in control, and the weakest nations in their currency controls are dominant because they have the most debt out there. Wow.
Yeah, it's really dystopian, because we had a point where the dollar index was very strong, and the strong dollar was hurting the emerging markets because the commodities prices had fallen and they owed so much dollar-denominated debt. So if the dollar had stayed strong and the commodity prices hadn't rebounded, we were going to see a massive amount of defaults very soon. So we were very close to that. I think that's why we've kind of had a financial engineering here of some of these commodity price rally. I think the Wall Street banks knew the defaults were coming unless there was a rally in commodities.
They're going to be defaults anyway. It's too much debt, and you can't have a 10% rebound after a 50% decline and call that a recovery. That's crazy. It's like a baseball game. You're 10 runs behind. You pick up a couple runs in the 7th inning and you say, well, we're in good shape now. No, you're down 10-2. It's too little, too late. This is one of the big surprises for me in the last year is that we haven't had a single emerging market nation with a default on their debt. So I think what's happening, Jason, is we're seeing the Federal Reserve and the Euro Central Bank come in there with bridge loans to pay their interest payments and prevent the defaults, just like they're doing with some of the energy companies.
Yeah, I think that's a very plausible scenario. I would also add to this commodities price rally, I don't think it's on the global economy getting any better. So I think it's mostly this commodities price rally either on financial engineering or in devalued currencies factoring in then higher commodity prices. So when the currencies fall, the dollar index falls and these other currencies fall, the commodity prices are going to have to go higher whether the global economy is doing well or not.
Well, maybe, but some of the price supports for these commodity rallies have been propaganda reports about, well, there's not as much gas supply and oil supply as we thought. But what they're not doing is counting the 600 tankers floating around Singapore. loaded with
Yeah,
oil.
yeah.
Okay, I mean,
Yeah, that's
you can always come up with lies. If you control the press, you can always come up with lies. And it will
a great
support
point.
the syndicate position. And there are a lot of good creative writers involved in that. I have a friend who 2 years ago, he loves to tell the story. He was doing a zip line canopy tour, which is like a cable line at 30, 40 feet off the ground, where you zip from one tree to another, and you land on a platform, and then you take a rest, and 10 people arrive, and then you go to the next platform. You do 15 or 20 of them. You call it a day. It's a tremendous thrill. One of the guy on his zip line tours was a German fellow. And he asked the German guy, what do you do for work back in Germany? He said, well, I'm a propaganda writer. So my friend
At
said,
least he was honest, right?
what the hell is that? And he said, well, we write propaganda like against Russia and in favor of Ukraine, and we just write whatever we're told by Langley. Oh, okay. That's interesting, you little whore.
I remember another journalist coming out and saying that too in Europe. I don't know if it was the same guy you're referring to, but I remember there was a big deal like a month or so ago about this on Zero Hedge. Some guy actually like went on a rant.
Well, that wasn't my story. My story is over a year old, and my friend did not go public with it. I did, and without any details or names or office function or whatever in Germany. No, Germany is in the process of flipping east, Jason, and it's going to be an extraordinary challenge because all the security agencies are run by Langley, and the Chancellor's office is run by Washington. And Germany is essentially a slave state. They don't like it. They're a proud people, and they're coming to realize how much Washington has put in their hooks in their own necks and their backs and their backsides. So, interesting times.
Now, Jim, I want to ask you also about a Bloomberg story I saw last month. They actually reported this in the mainstream press. I was surprised. There was an article in Bloomberg, like I said, saying that China wants to have more control over how all commodities are priced, since China is the largest buyer of many commodities. Do you think China is doing a step-by-step process to castrate the LBMA and the COMEX?
Well, sure. But again, it's a very long process. And if you want to control something that has, say, 5 arenas and 3 layers and 100 players, it's going to take a long time. I mean, you can't say, well, the U.S. dollar system is going to be disrupted and China's just going to install the RMB system. They got 40 years. They got 5, 7 platforms. They got some official banks, but China's made a lot of progress. They've made pretty much defunct the World Bank. They've ripped the guts out of the IMF. The IMF, what do they do anymore except arrange for slush funds for the Greek debt and the Ukraine debt, and then we learn later that the funds were all stolen. What the hell does the IMF do anymore? They issue reports. I heard Christopher Lagarde was arrested a few weeks ago for grand larceny and fraud. And I know he likes to go by the name of Christine, but I prefer the name Christopher because that is consistent with his childhood. So there's a lot going on, and it's going to take a long, long time. But the Chinese have made a lot of progress. They have the new development bank, which I believe is going to be a gold central bank for converting Western, primarily Treasury bond debt paper into gold bullion. I think the new development bank is going to be the central bank for gold that is the backbone for gold trade notes. The Chinese have set up the Asian Infrastructure Bank, which serves pretty much the World Bank and IMF function. It's being funded now. I think it has $100 billion, and they're announcing all kinds of infrastructure projects. Why isn't the United States, why isn't England, why isn't Western Europe involved in construction projects, in bridge, railroad, port facilities? Instead, all we hear about is military contracts. All we ever hear is about signing up another player for a war. All we hear is a new war in Mali to steal their gold to replenish the German repatriation theft. Why doesn't the West engage in capitalism? Because they're fascists, that's why. And they engage in war, theft, fraud, and destruction, control, and murder, genocide. So they've got the Asian Infrastructure Bank. They've got the New Development Bank. They now have a very important piece, Jason, called the Chinese Interbank Payment System, which will rival the SWIFT. So if China wants to make a payment with Iran, they don't need to deal with the SWIFT blockage and the sanctions. We're going to have a new generation here of blowback from the 20 years of abused sanctions that the United States has done, and all the repercussions and all the resentment and all the victim nations are going to get together, and they're going to isolate the United States. That is the big risk in the next couple of years for the United States. Isolation, declaration of rogue nation, accusations of war crimes, accusations of financial hegemony and financial fraud at a billion and trillion dollar level. And the U.S. is going to get quarantined while they're forced to create their own domestic dollar, which I call the Scheiss dollar. Scheiss is German for excrement, flotsam, jetsam, and shit. So the U.S. is going to have to deal with something very nasty in the next year, the creation of its own domestic currency, and then the rubber hits the road with the $40 billion monthly trade deficit, which comes to about $500 billion a year, $500 billion trade deficit. That, coupled with an independent domestic currency, Jason, is going to bring about colonization of the United States and a loss of its own sovereignty, because you cannot run a $500 billion trade deficit in a fair currency environment without losing $500 billion of assets every year to its investor base, which is going to be predominantly not American. We got some difficult times coming.
Yep, I think the world is going to be completely different in the next couple decades than it is right now. We've seen news stories come out that large Chinese gold miners are going to go on a buying spree soon and start buying up assets, because we know they've been just hoovering up the physical gold that they've been importing, from Swiss gold refiners and from etc.
Well, yeah, add in the Rand refinery. Here's a little paradox question for you. If the South African mines are down 60 to 70% in output in just the last 10 to 15 years, how come the Rand refinery has tripled its output?
U.S. has been exporting gold. Europe has been exporting gold to them.
No, well, maybe some. The Swiss and the British might have sent some for recasting, but most of the recasting is done in the several gigantic refineries of Switzerland. They don't need external help in Switzerland. They've got all kind of refineries. They have some on the Italian border that caught a lot of interest 20 years ago. I think the Swiss have 3 or 4 giant refineries, but the South African refinery, the Rand refinery, it specializes in smuggled African gold. Just think that the distress region of Congo, Zimbabwe, Zaire, they're all producing gold. It all goes to South Africa, Union of South Africa, the Rand refinery. Just for people to understand a little bit more about the size of these countries involved with smuggling and production of oil, of gold ore. Congo has roughly equal the land mass of all of Western Europe. That's a staggering statistic.
Now, Jim, do you think there's going to be supply problems for physical silver in large orders? Now, I'm not talking about, small little orders of American Silver Eagles. I'm talking tonnage. If we have a lot of these copper miners that produce silver as a byproduct, if these guys start going bankrupt, do you think that's going to cause an enormous problem in silver supply then?
Oh, I think it already is. The silver. If you want to know what's going on with copper, just follow the Chile economy, and they're hurting. So when I heard the Chile economy was hurting, my first thought was, well, Latin America is hurting. But my second thought was, what about all that byproduct silver? So it's a very big issue, the byproduct silver. But there's a phenomenon that's been the case now for 2 years. I'm not going to be able to quote actual figures. I don't have them in front of my face. If you take a look at just the demand for American Eagle silver coins and Canadian Maple silver coins, the demand is bigger than all the U.S. and Canadian silver mine output. There's a deficit just from coins. Now add on all the other applications that we know of: photography, medicine, electronics, pressure-treated lumber is one of the new ones that I find interesting, antiseptics. Okay, there's a tremendous amount of demand for silver outside of investment demand for bars and coins. Now, when you look at the demand for just the coins from Canada and the United States, you're not including the bars, 1,000-ounce bars, 1 kilogram bars. Okay, just from the coins there's a deficit. We're going to see an explosion in the silver price. If we don't see, I can't put time statements on this, time limits, but in the next several months or 2 years, if we don't see something close to $70 to $80 silver, I'll be absolutely shocked. So when people tell me, Jim, which mining stocks do you like? I say, I don't know. I'm not interested in mining stocks. Do you know how many projects they're going to have with a 20% stock share dilution? Do you know what their options are for executives? But I do know this. You're likely to see a 5-fold gain in the silver price the next couple of years. Does that interest you? Or would you rather have it a stock? Do you only feel good with the conquest of examining a bunch of alternatives and coming up with the winning stocks like you do a horse at Pimlico? And then they go, wow, you make a good point, but you know, Jim, buying a silver bar is kind of boring. Okay, there's your problem, Mr. Investor. You're looking for juice. You're looking for a big challenge. Instead, go with silver, wait them out. Whatever gains they have for gold, expect double or triple, perhaps, the gain to be for silver. Look for the gold-silver ratio to drop down to 25 or 30 to 1. And if certain negotiations take place, it's going to happen with some success. It's going to happen maybe a lot sooner than I thought. So there's a lot going on here, a lot of moving parts, Jason. And one of the problems in today's financial investment scenario, observation and challenges in all the arenas, and one of the big problems is that we really don't know where the important conferences and negotiations are taking place. We don't know who the parties are. We don't know what their roles are. We don't know who they represent. We don't know whether popular representation, like, say, Senate leaders, Senate Finance Committee leaders, although they pretty much work for Wall Street. The Dodd-Frank federal financial regulatory bill proved that they work for Goldman Sachs, JP Morgan, and Citigroup. No ifs, ands, or buts about that question. So,
yeah, Jim, I don't think any of these scumbag politicians can really be trusted right now. I think, most of these guys are total freaking hypocrites. They don't do what they say. They're willing to sell people out for $1 million checks here or there. A lot of these guys that were with the Panama Papers leaks and things like that, a lot of these guys that were asking for higher taxes were the ones sheltering the money.
Yeah, I know. There was one other step I forgot to mention in there. The Chinese are making a lot of progress. And one of the steps they made recently was to buy Barclays' 2,000-ton gold vault in London. There are just so many steps. Will China have control of pricing for commodities? I think they're going to have a much bigger vote and voice in the pricing. I don't know when it's going to happen. And I have kind of a joke that I recite to certain friends and colleagues, and especially to clients who ask tough questions like, when do you think this is going to happen? The answer is when China feels like it. When China decides that now we're going to flip the switch. When China decides that they can't really buy much more gold and silver at these ridiculously low artificial prices. I think it's pretty clear now that JP Morgan is a buying agent for replenishing the Chinese silver stockpile. There's a lot of evidence that points that. You can't say I proved it. All you can say is look at these 5 different pieces to the puzzle, and they all are coincidental with my conclusion that China has hired JP Morgan to replenish their silver stockpile, not gold. There's already tremendous Chinese control of the production in mining in Australia. They own the ports also. I mean, if you want to control the mining, make sure you control the ports, because if you control the ports, you can say, well, if you're not one of ours, you're not going through the port. It's called monopoly. China has studied very well the U.S. monopoly practices. The Chinese are not stupid, and they're far more patient than we are. I mean, when we say, well, gosh, they've had 10 months, where they've been, you got to translate that into Chinese. Well, where are we on their 10-year plan? We don't think like they do. They might think that after the April 19th date, where Shanghai had the gold fix and the gold futures contract in RMB, the Chinese might have concluded progress is really quite good so far. We bought the Barclays vault, got some other deals with the hub facilities. We're making a dent with the British exit. The Chinese are in the picture for the British exit. The Chinese are promising more RMB hub activity. They're promising more import-export trade and contracts. They don't need to deal with the EU fascist dictatorship. I love it when we get to topics where you can claim that there's a fascist dictatorship in the room, because it's almost amusing. I've talked with a lot of Americans in the last few years, and I really haven't encountered any who know what fascism is. It's really quite hilarious. As the United States moves away from democracy, away from the republic, and toward a capitalist, works toward a fascist state with 20 elements to back it up, nobody really regards it as a fascist state. My brother, for example, was a Phi Beta Kappa double major in college of political science and economics, and he does not believe the United States is fascist.
Well, he's probably a brainwashed Keynesian then, so.
Yeah, he is, but he's put a lot of that aside. He's a math teacher now. And that's all well and good, but I asked him, John, I mean, do you even know what fascism is? Well, of course, Jim, I studied. I said, well, John, a lot of things you study you don't know shit about. So you don't know what inflation is.
Yep. There's academic theories that the professor teaches, and then there's what actually happens in reality.
My brother actually admitted to me, Jason, that he didn't take one course. There was not a single course at his university for the bachelor's program, even in the honors section, not a single course on gold.
Of course not. These Keynesian central bankers think that, they need an elastic currency without gold so they can do all these types of liquidity programs. Because there's, with the Keynesians, there's always a liquidity trap. They always see deflation as the enemy, even though I think, deflation is good for the economy in the long term. It's good for the saver and the consumer. But yeah, China's adding bilateral trade agreements. They're doing a lot of currency swaps with their trading partners. Them and the Saudis, I think it's been revealed, have been dumping a lot of U.S. treasuries because they don't really need them anymore. They're moving on to the next system of global trade. So my final question for you then has to do with the oil market right now. We've seen a huge rally in the oil market. We have a lot of people on TV saying that, oh, this is all fundamentals. But do you think there's a manipulation tug of war in the oil market right now between the large low-cost country producers like the Russia and the Saudis who want the higher-cost producers all bankrupt, while Wall Street banks want to move oil prices higher to avoid declaring tens of billions in bad oil loans?
I actually think that's the secondary battle and not the primary battle. I like to focus on something that's a little bit overarching. Why did the oil price go down? Well, to be sure, there was less demand, and to be sure, there was some marginal increase in supply. But it doesn't explain a move from 110 down to 30. I don't even care what the current price is. Is it below 80? Obviously. Yeah. Therefore, it's still a critical problem. It's like being down 10-0 in the late innings of a baseball game, and suddenly you pick up, say, 4 runs. Wow, we're in good shape now. You're down 10-4. You're going to lose. Okay, I like to focus on overarching issue, like since 1973, what has been the principal hard asset that has, on a de facto basis, backed the dollar?
Petrodollar. Oil. Saudi oil.
Okay, but the commodity is oil. And if the oil price went down, would you not say that confirms the dead dollar?
That would be one way to look at it.
That's how I look at it. I don't say, oh, gee, I mean, I've got people who counter me and say, Jim, you don't understand what you're talking about. You really are dumb. The dollar's going up. And I said, no, the dollar's going up only in the dollar index. But the basis for the dollar, its rough de facto convertibility asset, is down 70% in value. And why is that? It's because the petrodollar foundation derivatives, all the financial structures, are being liquidated and have been liquidated since about 2014. It's the big derivatives that link the dollar, the euro, and the British pound with the oil price. They're being liquidated. And I think the liquidation is all part of a plan because the big banks who have the stake in the game saw that QE was not going to work. So after QE proved them correct in not stimulating the economy at all, it's not stimulus. It's a wet blanket. Well, actually, the 0% is a wet blanket, and QE is a capital killer by raising the cost structure. So the big players realized that the dollar is on its last legs, and they went about with Credit Suisse and UBS to steal Arab gold in the Swiss banks. And then they convinced the dumbass Saudis to engage in a Yemen war and follow the U.S. path with war crimes and civilian murder, genocide. And I think the United States has had a rather brilliant project with Saudi land. They created the cutouts. They got them to buy into all kinds of U.S. dollar assets. And one of the hidden assets for this dollar devotion for the Saudis is their roughly $3 to $4 trillion in treasury bonds that they cannot touch that serve as the core to the Department of Treasury's Exchange Stabilization Fund. They just had a recent edition of Saudi Arabia in the TIC report, the Treasury International Capital Report, and it shows a mockery of $160 billion for the Saudis. It's more like $3,000 billion. And they lost it. We stole it. We sequestered it. We made it part of the untouchable assets. If you think the Saudis, after all these years, have saved $160 billion in over 40 years of being the major OPEC exporter, you're an idiot. We stole their gold. We sequestered their $3 to $4 trillion in treasury bonds. We convinced them to buy U.S. military hardware for Yemen. And pretty soon, we might murder them. Now, is there a battle going on with the low-cost producers of Saudi and Russia versus the West? Yeah, but I think it's all secondary. Of course there is. It's all secondary. Primary is the death of the petrodollar, the dismantling of multi-trillion-dollar contracts that link the paper currencies to the oil price. The battle is really not going to be won. I just read a fantastic article last month about how they did not destroy the U.S. shale producers. They weakened them. They forced the weak ones out. They killed off the weakest of the shale producers. But there are several others that have slightly lower cost and can get by and actually make some money. The output, if the Saudis and the Russians, if you actually believe that they're in league to drive down the price to kill off the shale producers, I don't buy that for a minute. Not a minute. The Russians have no respect for the Saudis, and they've not yet teamed up with them. In fact, the Russians backed out of the Doha meeting, and gosh, was it Doha or is it one of the other? I think it was Doha. And the Russians said, you Arabs are not united. We're getting out of here. And then the last thing you know, the Saudis came in with Mohammed bin Salman firing al-Naimi and saying, no, we're not going to make any concessions at all. So the Russians were proved correct that you can't deal with the Arabs, that they don't unite on anything. And my joke is the OPEC meetings are totally defunct, useless, because Arabs cannot decide even with a consensus on their labels or the lunch menu. It's one of the most disorganized cultures in the history of mankind.
Yep. To add to your point, Jim, I think one of the Russian oil ministers or one of their higher-ups in their government also said that OPEC will break up in the near future, too.
I think it was Sechin, the CEO of Rosneft. He basically criticized OPEC as being a non-entity, a dead entity, and an irrelevant group. There's a joke that The Voice said to me several months ago. He said, but you still might see the OPEC ministers meeting in Vienna because they love the prostitutes there.
Well, I'm not surprised hearing that. Yeah, I'm outside of Washington, D.C., so that's common here, too, for the lobbyists and the politicians. Yeah. Well, Jim, we're a little over an hour. I think you've given our listeners a lot of things to think about what's going on in the global economy. If our listeners want to sign up for your newsletter, how do they do so?
Go to the www.goldenjackass.com. No hyphens or anything unusual. Goldenjackass.com. There's a lot of free material in there. Links to interviews like this. I have a public article approximately once a month. I used to do, honestly, Jason, I used to do 40 a year. But that was when I was building the business, and now what seems to have taken over is 4, 5, 6 different invitations for radio interviews. I didn't have any of them back in 04, 5, 6, maybe 1 or 2 here and there every several months. But anyway, on goldenjackass.com, you'll find a button that says subscribe, and it's to the Hat Trick Letter, which is located on the Golden Jackass website. And the monthly newsletters are 2. It's the Global Money Report. It's about defense of the dollar, all the global wars. We're in a world war. It's just financial. There are a lot of casualties. They're economies. They're industries. They're businesses. And the second report, more ground level, like actual coin demand, and I include Russia and China in this report. It's called the Golden Currency Report. And that's fitting for China and Russia, too, because they're working on the gold currencies, which I think are going to be major parts to the Eurasian trade zone. So goldenjackass.com is where you find it. And in April, I had my 12th anniversary, Jason. So things are moving right along. And I got to say, there is some damage from the economies. The economies forcing people to reevaluate their spending patterns. And I'm working hard to replace with new subscribers, all the people have lost their jobs and had to back out. And so far, so good. I'm still very near my peak subscriptions count, which was seen last November. So I can't say that of many of the competitors who I knew at the Cambridge House conference. One of them died and 4 or 5 of them went out of business. I had a kind of a challenge to some of them, because they would say to me, Jim, it seems like you're a little bit preoccupied with corruption. And I said, it seems to me like you're a little blind to corruption. And we got talking more and more, and we'd have some shrimp and they'd have some wine, loosen up a bit. And I'd say to them, I incorporate into my analysis and my forecasting function the corruption element. Do you? No, they say, we try to keep, I try to keep, the high ground and not mention corruption, and, just stick with the basics. And I said, oh, in other words, stick with the free market and all those theories that don't make any sense at all. And they said, well, I think they still do. And I said, are you prepared to go out of business because of wrong forecasts, since you don't factor in criminality? Like bond fraud following Lehman, during Lehman, that whole subprime bond fraud, the improper home foreclosures, all that crime, multi-billion-dollar, maybe trillion-dollar crime. And they say, no, we don't incorporate any crime in our forecast. I said, well, with wrong forecasts, I think you really just got a few years to go and you're going to be out of business. Oh, gosh, Jim, you're so funny. They're almost all out of business, Jason.
Yeah, I've worked in the newsletter industry before at larger firms, and a lot of them, just keep betting on regular stocks, and they trust the central bankers. They trust the bullshit numbers that Wall Street comes out with, and the investment banks and Federal Reserve and Bureau of Labor Statistics. They trust all these job numbers and stuff, and we know these things are, heavily spun and full of crap.
Well, that's why in 2004 and 5, when I built the foundation for the newsletter, what I did was I dismantled their statistics. I showed that the GDP was off by perhaps 2 to 3%. And now I make the argument, and I don't really have to defend it much. I say that since 2007 or 8, we've had annual 4 to 5% declines in the economy, a recession of 4 to 5% every single year.
Yep.
It's because
we have
No, it's because the price inflation is called 2.5% when it's really more like 6 and 7 and 8% or more.
Yep. We have stagflation in the real economy in the U.S., which means, higher unemployment or more people who are underemployed. We have people with multiple degrees who are bartenders or servers on part-time jobs, and their bills keep going up. So yeah, the people we talk to on Main Street in the U.S., a lot of them, the ones who actually pay their bills, who don't have a butler who don't work on Wall Street and don't have butlers, or their wives, pay their wives go grocery shopping and they don't care what the bills are. They just write a check every year. The regular people on Main Street, what they tell me is their bills keep going up every year for the expenses they have to have.
Yeah, there was a Chapwood index for price inflation, and it examined 500 different items in a basket, and did so for, I think, the last 5 years. And they did it in 50 different U.S. cities. And they came out with an overall, again, this is urban price inflation, 50 major cities. That's the bulk of the U.S. economy. And they came out with a conclusion that price inflation was right around 9.5 to 10%. And the U.S. economy in the last 5 years has declined 22% if you do proper price inflation adjustment to the nominal figures. In other words, when you see that there's a slight gain in the economy's numbers, the nominal numbers, the raw data, if you see a slight gain, the inflation is more than that, and sends it into negative territory after the proper adjustment.
Yep, and the jobs numbers that the U.S. comes out with are total BS too. Like this 38,000 jobs number, it was probably, a lot of those jobs were fake, created by the birth-death model. In the past, the last year or two, the U.S. has said that there were jobs created in the oil and gas industry, when if you looked at the, the earnings reports of the oil and gas companies in North Dakota, Texas, Oklahoma, they weren't hiring anyone. They were firing people like crazy, massive amounts. And the aggregate statistics for the jobs numbers that the Bureau of Labor labor statistics put out said the jobs increased in oil and gas. And they've been doing the same bullshit stuff with the retail sector. I was listening to retail expert Howard Davidowitz talk about how, you know, Macy's and so many of these retail companies were firing people like crazy. The government comes out with a jobs number in the last couple of quarters saying that the retail was hiring. Well, you know, on their conference calls, they're firing people. So that it's just total lies. It's propaganda. Unbelievable.
You know, one of the little devices we used when I was working in a couple of jobs, and actually it was Staples. We came up with the individual components. And we asked the question, do the individual components add up to the overall story that we're hearing? And the answer was almost always no. So you can't say that 1 + 1 + 1 = 12. You can't do that. You got to look at the component. If like right now, Challenger Gray and Christmas are coming out with incredible job cut numbers for the biggest U.S. industries, the biggest U.S. companies. Intel, IBM, Microsoft, and Cisco are all laying off big numbers. Where's the job growth? If the biggest are making huge cuts, where's the overall job growth? I tell you where it is. It's in part-time jobs. And
or maybe it's the
government. Jason, they're being counted as jobs.
Yeah.
I thought when you said, I'll tell you where it's coming from. I thought you were going to say it's coming from part-time jobs. No, it's partly. It's, you know, just a piece to the puzzle is the part-time jobs. And why are the part-time jobs flourishing so? Because of Obamacare. Companies don't want to hire. They don't want to hit that 50 limit. And they're finding that with Obamacare, the rules have been adjusted since the origin of Obamacare. If a small company, a very small company with 30 people, get bought out by a bigger company that has, you know, 3 small subsidiaries, whoops, you're over 50. So they all are eligible and required to join Obamacare. Wow. Obamacare is one of the worst things that ever hit small business America.
I think Obamacare was done intentionally, though, to fail, so now they can set it up for a, you know, single-payer, full European or Canadian healthcare system. I think that's what's coming next. They're going to say, well, Obamacare wasn't enough. We have to do more. We have to go to universal healthcare, single-payer system, and things like that, unfortunately. But yeah, to add to your point there about the part-time jobs that were created, I was actually going to make a joke about how, you know, the people who like big government are just going to say, oh, we'll just create more government agencies for regulation and stuff like that, and that'll create jobs.
Yeah, government jobs. We'll have to increase the tax base in order to pay for all that. Or just print more money to cover the deficits. Oh, I tell you, we're on a wrong path for every single major challenge and policy in the U.S. government. Every single one.
Yep, it's dystopian. And the people who bring this up, Jim, you know, they probably dodge taxes. So either they figured out how to reduce their tax bill or they don't pay much taxes at all. When people are talking about spending other people's money, you know, they're willing to spend as much of it as required. They don't care.
I never spend other people's money. Do you?
Nope.
Yeah.
Well, I just want to thank you for your time, Jim, and we'll have you on again in a couple months. I enjoyed the discussion.
Oh, it's always good talking with you, Jason. I love talking with intelligent, well-informed people.